Roger, can you tell me the story of when you were a little boy on how you got into philosophy and the journey and how it culminated with you publishing books on the philosophy of William Shakespeare, which you discovered from your study of his sonnets?
In the interviews that we've done up to this point, we've looked at this large folio presentation of the whole set of 36 plays with commentary around them. And we've related that massive book to the other publications, the other 8 books that have been produced over the last number of years, over the last 25 years or so. And then for the last interview, we focused more on the bust of Shakespeare that features on all the fronts of every book. And I went back to my time when I was a student, when I started to carve small heads and managed to use one of the heads to get access to the Elam School of Fine Art, which then led on to making artworks and eventually making figurative works, which led me through to the Wanganui Sargent Gallery and the introduction to the Shakespeare group, and then the Shakespeare Philosophy, and then the development and production of the head, which is now outside the Stratford Library. The other strain of interest is not so much the sculptural one, but the philosophical one. And so even on this title page, for instance, it says, using Shakespeare's nature-based philosophy from his 1609 sonnets to understand the play. So what then is the nature-based philosophy, and why should it be called a nature-based philosophy, for instance? And if I think back, as you have sort of prompted me somewhat, is that when I was 9, living in Raetihi, my parents very kindly gave me an animal book. And here it is, Happy Birthday on the 24th of the 7th, 56 from Mum and Dad. So definitely at the age of 9. And as you can see, it's quite a large animal book for a 9-year-old. And I took to it with a huge amount of interest. And one of the most amazing photographs in it is this shot here of a couple of our forebears looking very proudly out at us. Not that my parents would have necessarily have recognised them as our forebears, but they end up being our forebears. And as a 9-year-old reading a book of this density, I came across another page where there's a photograph of a tiger that has got hold of a beater and is injuring the beater. And the byline at the bottom of the picture says that they managed to rescue the beater, but unfortunately he died from his injuries. So as a 9-year-old reading a book about animals, and you're coming across these pretty real-life sort of situations. But the most intriguing thing about the book, in terms of my parents giving it to me and them not necessarily realising what quite they were giving me, was the last chapter in the book was called The March of Evolution. And here at the age of 9, I was being introduced to the idea of evolution. And even to the point where on one of the pages through here, The Ancestry of Man, it talks about Charles Darwin's Origin of Species and the Descent of Man. Now, I can't say that I picked up and took an interest in evolution at that time, but at that tender age when I had a very inquiring mind, it certainly began the process of starting to ask questions about where we were in the world and what our relationship was to the animal world, etc.
That's incredible that you would have been given that book and you would have studied it and read. So let's fast forward. What happened next?
I read widely in that time. In fact, we had very few books at home, and so I ended up reading dictionaries. But by the time I got to university in Wellington, I was beginning to be introduced to serious books, literature books and books of criticism. And then on to the architecture school, where one of the books that we suggested reading was this book here called Philosophy in a New Key by Susan Langer. And the most interesting thing about that for me is not only was it talking about another way of doing philosophy, a different way of doing philosophy than the traditional way of doing philosophy. One of the thinkers that she introduced, who I'd never heard of before, was Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian-German philosopher, who ended up spending quite a bit of time in England through the 1920s and 30s, studying with under Bertrand Russell. And I became intrigued with his thinking and began to read widely in Wittgenstein. And it just happened in the late 1960s and into the 1970s, where he had only published one book in his lifetime in 1922 and had prepared another book for publication by 1950 when he died. His books weren't published and they started coming out over the 20-year period from that time. And one of the critical books for me was this book called Uncertainty, which was one of the last books published in the 1970s. And it moves away from his earlier philosophizing under Russell to consider his more nature-based understanding and the idea that nature and things like parents are givens that we don't question, and was looking to make a philosophy based on that.
So Roger, is all this study that you're describing happening when you were at architecture school and then art school?
Yes, well, I was still quite young. I mean, I started architecture school when I was 19 and moved on to art school about 3 or 4 years later, so I was in my early 20s. And after my period of interest in Wittgenstein, which continued, of course, as I was reading more and more of his books, at art school I was introduced to the artwork and the thinking of Marcel Duchamp, and that really took me also in the way that the Ludwig Wittgenstein ideas had taken me. And it just happened also that Duchamp had died in 1968, and so a considerable number of volumes were published on his life and on his work in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. And I happened to be in the university bookshop and came across this little booklet here called Marcel Duchamp or the Castle of Purity by Octavio Paz, the Mexican poet. And Paz very insightfully talks about Duchamp as both criticising myths, but that his whole set of work is effectively the myth of criticism, the idea that a myth has a particular function or purpose in life, but it's not necessarily the be and end all of life. And so he actually articulates the logical conditions for any myth in his artworks, and that really fascinated me.
So Roger, what you're describing, this is the early 1970s?
Yes, by the time I graduated from the art school, I had completed a number of installations which were quite successful, but I was also having doubts and questions about my understanding of art, and I was looking to Duchamp to try and get a better understanding of art. And so as I read more widely, and as we moved at that time, or in the late 1970s, to Taranaki, I began to read across just about every subject you can think of at the tertiary level, geomorphology and geology and psychology. I went through a bit of a crisis in the mid-1980s and started walking around a block on which our house was sited in Eltham in Taranaki. And as I did so, and as I went through a healing process, I started having a sort of a sense of clarity about the way in which things were and my life was, until I wrote out a little booklet which I called Human Being. Well, it wasn't intended to be a booklet. I presented it to a printer to have the pages printed, but he said he could bind it for me. So in 1987 I had this little booklet bound. Having not had much reception to that, and of course it wasn't published, I continued to work in the figurative mode until eventually I had the show at the Sargent Gallery in Wanganui. And as a consequence of meeting up with a friend who was then living in Wanganui, Peter Scannell, he introduced me to a book that he said he was having a bit of difficulty understanding, a book by Ted Hughes called Shakespeare and the Goddess of Complete Being. And again, here's someone like Hughes talking about the mythic dimension in Shakespeare's work, and I've been fascinated or considering what the mythic criticism, for instance, that Duchamp was playing with in his work. So I read the book quite assiduously. I was sort of a little bit disturbed by the fact that he seemed to be representing gods and goddesses. But at the same time, my interest in Shakespeare was increasing. And so after the show, I began to attend the Shakespeare group in Wanganui, and eventually they decided to read the sonnets. And it just happened that through the reading of the 154 sonnets over a weekend, I sensed that the philosophy in the sonnets was a much more sophisticated development of the rudimentary philosophy I'd written out and published, or effectively published, in 1987.
So Roger, it's the mid-90s. You're reading the sonnets of Shakespeare, like-minded people. You realise you've got something unique. I'm curious, what did you do next? Of course, culminating with William Shakespeare's Sonnet Philosophy, the 4 volumes, which was published in 2005.
Yes, well, the last thing I expected, I suppose, after reading the sonnets in Wanganui and having just had an exhibition at the Sargent Gallery, was that I would be writing at all. But in the end, that's what I had to do. And I began the process. And one of the things that helped the process was to become part of the Shakespeare group in Stratford. And then, at my suggestion, I began to write a sonnet column in the Stratford Press, and that lasted for 6 years. And every 2 weeks, I would explain a sonnet. And that sonnet column was a way of preparing the material for what became Volume 2 in the 2005 publication. Volume 1 was dedicated to explaining the philosophy in general, and then Volume 3 looked at some plays and the longer poems. And in Volume 4, I considered the influences that had led me to understand the philosophy, people like Marcel Duchamp, Ludwig Wittgenstein and Charles Darwin, and quite a considerable number of other people. It took another 6 or 7 years until the whole set was ready for print, and then we published them with the aid of a grant in 2005. And this is the completed set, 1,760 pages, 600,000 words, detailing everything that I had discovered up until that point.